From a couple who has perhaps far too many pets to a country ravaged by the Vietnam War. From building 19th century roads through the rugged mountains to building a road back to the future. From the thoughts of a wonderful, much-loved author at the end of her life to considering what we all should do and how we all should approach mortality and the end of our lives. I have 6 books here for you today in my nonfiction November wrap-up. Hi, I'm Kim, and this is An Oasis of Books. And while I did mention these 6 nonfiction books briefly in my last video, my 20 books I read in November, my big November reading wrap-up, today I want to go into a little more depth on each of them. So among these 6 books, I have 1 3-star, 3 4 stars, and 2 4.5 stars. We're going to go in ascending order, starting with the average 3.0 book and ending up with the 2 nonfiction books in November I rated the highest and enjoyed the most. So, first book is Enslaved by Ducks. This is by Bob Tarte, and the subtitle is How One Man Went from Head of the Household to Bottom of the Pecking Order. Now, I thought I was going to love this book because I have ducks, I have chickens, ducks, sheep, goats, cats, and a dog. I mean, look at that picture. Isn't that duck adorable? My ducks are really cute too. And they're very entertaining, by the way. However, this book just didn't work for me. I think it might work for some people. If your sense of humor matches Bob Tarte's, that might be, all it takes. I don't know. But it felt very outdated. It was published in 2003, but for me, it felt like it was written in the 1970s. Bob's sort of attitude toward his wife and just little things he said along the way. I read most of this book fully. I skimmed bits and parts here and there that just really didn't work for me because the book feels kind of disjointed, really. It's not a one continuing story arc. It's just a lot of little anecdotes, like lots and lots. And so, yeah, if I was reading this one anecdote at a time, like in a newspaper, they still have those, well, I don't even know if I'd like it then because I guess my sense of humor just doesn't match up with his. For instance, he deals with a lot of anxiety, which you very gradually learn about, and he talks about visiting his therapist and the drugs he's prescribed, and it's all treated very lightly, very superficially, which felt kind of weird to me. Yeah, the way he portrayed both himself and his wife made them come across to me like they didn't really know what they were doing and perhaps should have gotten some advice and maybe had a few less animals. But, who am I to judge? I know there are people who think I have way too many animals. So this worked for them. And the writing might work for you. You might think it's hilarious. A lot of the reviewers think that. Just didn't work totally for me. So despite the cute picture, Enslaved by Ducks ended up being my 3.0 in November. Now, the first of my 4.0 reads was Where Rivers Part, a story of my mother's life by Kalia Yang. This is set first in Laos, then in Thailand, and then in the US. So this is the story of the author's mother, first as a child, then as a teenager, and then finally throughout her entire adult life. And I expected going into it to learn a lot more about what was going on in Laos with the Hmong people who had been, hired, I guess you'd say, by the CIA and America to fight for them in the Vietnam War there in Laos. And I didn't really learn much at all, except that, it was horrifying. It was really about the aftermath. So the book begins when the author's mother, Chu, is a child in the 60s. And so we get glimpses of what the war was like, how awful it was. But it quickly moves on to her teenage years in the mid-70s when the U.S. pulled out of Laos, leaving them the Hmong people behind to be attacked and basically for genocide to be happening there against the Hmong people. Chu and her family were on the run, as were all the others, living in the forest, freezing, starving, not having any idea how this was going to end or when. And in one moment of desperation, I guess, of hope, Chu decides to marry a teenage boy that she happens upon as a way of getting out. And he and his family take her off to Thailand, to refugee camp there. This was a spur-of-the-moment decision by Chu. She thought she'd have more time to reflect on it, but she didn't. And she regrets this decision the rest of her life. You can feel throughout the whole book that she wonders how things would have been different if she'd stayed with her mother. But she does move on, and she and her husband and his family live in Thailand in the refugee camps for several years, trying to get out of there, but not having any luck, still dealing with horrible living conditions, no money, very, very little in the way of medical treatment. I also was expecting to learn more about the Hmong communities, the Hmong culture, really, and I got very little bit of that either. So that was disappointing. The bulk of this book deals with when they finally get to immigrate to the U.S., Chu and her husband and their 2 daughters at that point. And the focus of the book becomes Chu's willingness to sacrifice everything, both on a daily basis and in her whole life, for her children, hoping and really trying to force their lives to be much, much better than hers, to give her own life meaning, perhaps. And she succeeds in that, but it is difficult to read about. The book definitely portrays how desperate she is to make sure her children grow up to have stable, financially and otherwise, lives, unlike herself. And I appreciated that. I was just a little disappointed that there wasn't more about the Hmong culture, maybe even a little about Laos today and how the children took their parents back to visit. And that was an ordeal in some ways. But, I would have loved to have heard, instead of having to research it on my own, how Laos is still dealing with the after effects, so long, 50 years later, of the cluster bombs that did not detonate and are still injuring people every year. But that's not what the book is about. So that's why it was a 4.0. I'm glad I read it, and it was good, just not in the way I had expected. The third nonfiction book I read in November was another memoir, another 4.0, and it was Future Boy, My Journey Through the Space-Time Continuum by Michael J. Fox. Now, I've read every book Michael J. Fox has written. I really like this guy. I grew up with him, and watching how he's dealt with Parkinson's and how his family has supported him and how he has raised so much money for research into Parkinson's has been just wonderful. And I appreciate the fact that his memoirs all have a laser focus. This one is focused on 1985, the year that he filmed both his award-winning, very successful and very loved sitcom Family Ties and the first film in the Back to the Future trilogy. And I learned a lot I didn't know, which is surprising, again, given how much I follow Michael J. Fox. But yeah, again, laser focus. So this book has a lot of interviews with cast and crew that have never been seen before because he did them for this book. There are all kinds of photographs in here, both from the set at Family Ties as well as the set at Back to the Future, and from Michael J. Fox's own life at the time. Now, he was very young at this point, just 23 years old, so that is perhaps why he had the ability, the stamina to do what he did, which is film all day at Family Ties and then be driven across town to film most of the night for Back to the Future. You also get inside information about Huey Lewis and the News, the group that wrote and performed the song for the movie, The Power of Love. Very interesting story there. And Huey Lewis does a cameo as one of the judges in the high school prom music competition that Michael J. Fox's character Marty and his friends perform in. And that was really eye-opening because Huey Lewis didn't really want to write it, didn't think the movie was going to be a success. And yet it ended up that the song came out and was doing so well that they rushed the post-production of the movie, finishing it faster, I think, than any other post-production has been done. And a very short time after the filming ended, the movie came out, taking advantage of that song's popularity. And the rest is history. The movie and its sequels went on to become legendary, as did Michael J. Fox. So yeah, this was a very enjoyable read. And if you are interested in either Michael J. Fox or the filming industry at all, because it goes into a lot of background information with the director and producer and cast and crew, I would suggest giving this one a read. Now for my final 4.0 book. It's called Being Mortal, Medicine and What Matters in the End by Atul Gawande. This was published in 2014, and I read it just after it came out over a decade ago. And when I did, I thought it did a really good job at discussing this topic. But having reread it, my impressions have changed. I can see now several areas where it's lacking. So when I first reread it, and I think even in my November wrap-up video when I briefly mentioned it, I said I gave it a 3.5. I've now changed that rating to a 4.0 because I think if you've never read this book before and you haven't read other books on this topic and you come to it, you're probably going to give it a 4.5 or even a 5 because it's very well written and it broaches a lot of important questions rather, about this topic. So yeah, I tried to, in my re-rating of it, balance that out. For me, again, I have, since reading this a decade ago, read more about this topic, aging and the end of life, and what types of care are available, the options we should consider. And so that's why, after thinking about it, I understand why the book hit me differently this time. Hi, it's the next day, and in my editing, I'm finding that in discussing Gawande's book, Being Mortal, I had a lot to say. So much so that it made up over half of the footage I filmed. So I decided my discussion of this book deserved a video all its own, which means that at the same time I post my nonfiction November wrap-up video, I'll be posting a separate Being Mortal video. And in that video, I'm going to strongly recommend you read this book if you haven't yet read much on this topic. I'm also going to discuss the areas I found lacking in the book, give some examples, personal ones, of various end-of-life scenarios, and recommend another book, a great practical follow-up book, which focuses specifically on palliative care. Now back to your regularly scheduled video. Now we come to the two 4.5 nonfiction books I read in November. The first, another memoir, is by Ursula Le Guin, the wonderful, I used to say sci-fi writer, but more and more I'm finding out she's written so much more than that. Yeah, nonfiction like this memoir, but also things like alternative history. So yeah, I have more to explore in the way of her writing. And this book, No Time to Spare, Thinking About What Matters in the End, published in 2017, was great. Now, she wrote this, it turns out, just a few years before she died. And yeah, it's about what she was thinking about in those final years. And it's one of those wonderful books you can pick up, read a little bit, and put down, and come back to a week later and have no problem getting back into it, because each chapter is a completely different topic. It's a different time, she's in a different mindset, and so are you maybe. And it works so well that way. I found some of the chapters to be hilarious. There are a lot of chapters that feature her cat, her relationship with the cat, and those are just heartwarming. And then just some really thought-provoking, serious chapters too. I mean, sometimes she's talking about just common frustrations you have in life in general, or at the end of your life as you're older and people start, looking right through you. And sometimes she broached a topic where I had to sit and really think about it because it just struck home so deeply. So I thought this was a fantastic read, and I'm so glad I got to it in November. And I can see that it would be an amazing gift for a lot of people too. Not just elderly people. No, younger people too. She is very astute, very funny, very entertaining, and such a good writer. And now the final nonfiction book I read in November, the other 4.5 rating I gave. This is Sierra Crossing: First Roads to California by Thomas Frederick Howard. And this covers the history of, well, making the roads that made access to California possible from 1841 to 1869. And what's with those dates? Well, between 1841 and 1844, you had the people exploring coming over on foot, with horses and donkeys and such, but not wagons yet. Then beginning in 1845, you have the wagon trains that start coming, and ending in 1869 with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. But what this book is really about is building those roads through those massive mountains, all it took to make that possible, and how that evolved along the way. In fact, there's really, to be fair, not a lot of information in here about the railroads. That's toward the end of the book, and what it does present is very interesting. But the bulk of the book is about the exploration and the carving out of the roads, about the geography and the topography, the cartographical maps that were drawn and referred to and redrawn. The book is full of absolutely wonderful primary sources from journals at the time, newspapers at the time, as well as amazing primary source photographs from the time. Let me show you a couple of them because I love the way the author has put an old photograph side by side with a current photograph of the same view. Well, I say current, but the book was published in 1998, 27 years ago, so the current photographs are from 1996 for the most part. But still, that's a long time removed from the 1860s, which is when the bulk of the old photographs were taken. Now I'm going to put a larger photo up above so you can see the details, but in this first double-page spread of two photos, we see Placerville, the town. Back then it was called Hangtown for reasons. And you can see the main street and how it looked in 1860 and how it looks in 1996. Now, this is a place I visit frequently as I am a student, an explorer in the gold rush towns myself, and I can vouch that it still looks pretty much the same way today as it did in 1996. So on the page with the vertical double photos, we can see Pyramid Peak. And in the top photo from the early 1860s, we see the grade at Slippery Ford. And in the bottom photo, that same place we see from the vantage of US Highway 50. Amazing, the quality of that road in the early 1860s. And here we see empty wagons returning on the Lake Tahoe Wagon Road from the Comstock Lode mines in the early 1860s. The amount of material that they were able to move in this kind of terrain. Now, John Fremont was a leader in early California history. He was an officer in the Army's Corps of Topographical Engineers, and he was the last explorer of the Sierra Nevada before the wagon train era began. He did 3 major expeditions in 1842, 1843, and 1844. There's a lot of information on him and others in this book, taken from their journals, as I said, and it is just fascinating. And if, like me, you're very much into geography and topography and how in the world they got over those mountains to begin with, and how did they build the railroad tracks right through those mountains, then this book is really something you should get your hands on. You know, some of those journals you might think are dry reading and difficult to understand, but not really. These were people just like you and me. Well, actually, no, they're a lot hardier, a lot more resilient, a lot more resourceful, but they're sure fun to read about. And sometimes they're great writers too, like Fremont. Listen to this excerpt from his journal entry. The author, Howard, had this to say: Fremont definitely had a flair for cartographic description. On the official map of his 1843-1844 expedition, in a long arc from north to south across the western part of the United States, the Great Basin was labeled thus: The Great Basin, diameter 11 degrees of latitude, 10 degrees of longitude, elevation above the sea between 4 and 5,000 feet, surrounded by lofty mountains. Contents almost unknown, but believed to be filled with rivers and lakes which have no communication with the sea, deserts and oases which have never been explored, and savage tribes which no traveler has seen or described. Now talk about drama. He's got it for you. The author goes on to say that Fremont returned from that expedition in the fall of 1845 and found his way back to the Truckee River, crossed over what later became Donner Pass, reaching Sutter's Fort December 9th. And as he passed over the summit, he noticed ruts made by wagons. The age of wheeled traffic over the Sierra had begun. So if you've watched my channel for very long, you do already know that I love early California history. And this book has been an excellent addition to my studies, and I highly recommend it to anyone not just interested in California history, but interested in road building, interested in expansion of a country. Nothing to do with the ethics of that in this book. This is all about the practicalities of it, which, again, I'm saying that word over and over, but fascinating. So those were the 6 nonfiction books I read in November. That's all for today, but I'll be seeing you again soon. Until then, if you love nonfiction reading, more power to you. Enjoy. And if you are someone that's just getting your feet wet, I encourage you, keep trying, because there are nonfiction books out there for everyone. There are so many topics, it's limitless. So explore, have fun, and share what you read with others, especially me. Have a great week. See you soon.